Hi, my name is Selena and welcome to Selena's Musings. Now to start, I know musings is a bit of a strange word, so I consulted with my good sis Google to help me find a pretty simple definition of the word for y'all, so here it is. A musing, as a noun, is a period of reflection or thought. So it's simply that I'll be sharing my different reflections and thoughts and inspirations on various things. Today's musings going to be about one of the biggest questions of life, which is whether or not everything happens for a reason, like in a divine sense, or if that's something that we tell ourselves so that we'll feel better. So with that said, I'm going to start with a quote, which is actually one of my favorite quotes on the subject matter. Now, bear with me, y'all. I'm going to be reading this. I didn't have my printer handy, so I wrote this out. It's in my handwriting, which is not the best. So hopefully I can get through it without stumbling. So here we go. I believe that everything happens for a reason. People change so that you can learn to let go. Things go wrong so that you can appreciate them when they're right. You believe lies so you can eventually learn to trust no one but yourself. And sometimes good things fall apart so better things can fall together. Now that might sound familiar to you all. It's actually a quote by Marilyn Monroe. And while I often will go towards, the more deep philosophical kind of sources, you'll hear me talk a lot about, the Socrates and the Platos and the Aristotles. I think there's a lot of wisdom here. There's a lot of insight here, and there's a lot of different ways to kind of pull this apart. So question is, do I agree with Marilyn? Well, the answer is yes and no. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that. So, when I ask myself, does everything happen for a reason? I have to kind of think through, as a spiritual person who believes that we are spiritual beings having a human experience and not the other way around. I think key to being a spiritual being with this human experience is the fact that we have free will, right? So I really do believe that we have free will. I don't believe that everything is predetermined and that we don't have choices. I think that's why we have this experience, or a big part of why we have this experience, right? If everything was already predetermined, then in a way it would feel kind of futile, right? But this is where maybe, I'm just kidding myself, but I do believe in divine intervention. So I'm going to kind of break that down a little bit more. So free will. I think that there are certain circumstances in life that we cannot control, that are out of our control. However, within every circumstance, there's some degree of choice in terms of how we respond to those circumstances, right? So simple example, I have asthma. I don't have any choice in that, right? It's something that I developed in infancy, was probably born with. And so I've had to make certain choices in terms of how I manage that. That said, where I do think divine intervention is a thing, there have certainly been times where I was like this close to not making it and things really had to line up in a certain way. And I think, when it comes to like the really, really big critical things, I think there are kind of juncture points where the divine, God, the creator, the universe, however you might understand this force, will kind of guide your decisions or guide certain things so that they are more likely to go towards your greater good or your benefit. One of the tools that I think that the creator uses for this is discomfort. I don't know about y'all, but one thing that I have learned in life is that whenever it's kind of time for me to move on from one chapter that I'm in to the next, a lot of time God will allow me to become very, very, very uncomfortable. And unfortunately for me, a lot of times in life, I have been very hesitant to let go of things. And so I had to get way, 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 way uncomfortable for me to really like start listening and start making different choices. And I think of one period in particular in my life where I really did feel like things were guiding me bigger than myself. Like there was something very, very like divine and universal it felt. In fact, I had a colleague at the time who told me, Selena, I don't really even believe in God like that, but when I see how things are shaping out here, I can't help but feel like there's something big and weird going on, right? So I'll make this story a very long story. I'm gonna try to make it short. And I'm sure I'll reference this story in later points because it just was a huge pivot point in my life. At any rate, when I was growing up, going to college was a very big deal in my community. A lot of folks that I went to school with, we were all dealing with a lot of challenges. A lot of us did not graduate high school. And so going to college was a very big deal. I went to community college, worked my way up to a 4-year university, went to school at nights and on the weekends, and I got my bachelor's degree. And I thought, yes, I'm done. I did it, right? I reached the promised line. And then like a year or so later, a mentor was like, okay, Selena, so when are you going to grad school? And I was like, what? Grad school? You mean more school? I thought this was it. Thought I was done. But, she planted that seed and I was like, okay, this is something that I'd never considered. Let me look into it. And to be frank with you, I really didn't know much about graduate school. And this might sound crazy, but I actually thought, you know what? I'll go to law school because I like debating. I was on the debate team, did a few debates. I did moot court, which is like mock court kind of once, and I enjoyed that. And I kid you not, this is true. This is what I thought. I like law and order. I could do that, right? So I'm thinking that being a lawyer is all about being in court, making arguments. At any rate, I talked to some other mentors of mine that were lawyers. They were amazingly supportive, actually helped pay for me to get the test prep needed to take the test to get into law school, which is called the LSAT. Went through those classes, took the LSAT, started applying to law schools. And in the process, I realized, I don't really think this is what I want to do in my life. And I had a breakdown, right? I had invested so much into this. Not only had I invested so much into this, but other people in my life had invested in this, like with their money, with their time, with their expertise. But something in my spirit, it just didn't sit right. I kind of panicked. So even though I had everything working in my favor on paper to make this step, something just didn't feel right. I felt off. There were also a lot of other things going on in my life at this time. I've been working for a really great job that I love with coworkers that I loved, but I was kind of feeling like I was reaching a plateau there. A lot of the friends in my life at the time, we were starting to kind of grow apart. A relationship that I had been in for a long time had also kind of started to fall apart. And I just kind of felt like I was losing everything and I was really distraught. So I spent like a couple of months in what I would call the wilderness, where everything was unknown. I didn't know what I wanted to do with myself. I was feeling really discouraged. And I was asked by an organization that I volunteer with, that I was on the board with for a long time, to volunteer at an event that's really near and dear to my heart. It's a conference, a student lobbying conference, where students from all over the state of California get together at the state capitol and they do proposals for the State Board of Education. It's a great conference. It is an exhausting conference because you're in the course of 4 days working with dozens and dozens of high school students to put together proposals that actually have to be clear, good, and accurate enough to present to the State Board of Education. So at these conferences, I'm not sleeping much. I'm at it for like 20 hours straight. And I remember on the last night of the conference when we were all up super late, exhausted out of our minds, working on finalizing these proposals, I had like an epiphany. I was like, I am here delirious. I'm exhausted. I haven't had any sleep. I'm not getting paid for this. In fact, I'm using my paid vacation time to be here. And I am feeling joyful. I'm loving this. So I thought, what if I could find a career that makes me feel kind of like this, right? Where I'm working with young people, which I love. At the time, I was actually working at an elementary school. But I'm also thinking about changing systems, which is something that had always been important to me. I'd always been involved in student government and things like that. And I thought back to my undergraduate and said, what was one of the things I studied that was closest to this? And it was organizational behavior. It was a class that I took in the business department called organizational behavior, where you learn about how people function within organizations and, how do you make change and transformation within organizations and how that relates to people's behavior, psychology, so forth and so on. So I thought about that and I was like, you know what? Let me reach out to the teacher or the professor who taught that class, who also happened to be the head of the business department at my university. So I reached out to her, scheduled a meeting, sat down, and told her about my passion in the area of interest. And she said, you can actually get a master's degree in organizational behavior. And I was like, word? She actually had a PhD in it. I was like, oh, bet, maybe I should go get a PhD. And she was like, well, you should only get a PhD if you want to go into academia or research. Sounds like you want to be a practitioner. So I would suggest you get your master's. So I was like, okay, cool. So then I set out to do the research to find a master's program. Now, in doing this, I had a bit of a hard time because it seemed like most of the master's programs were PhDs, or they kind of leaned toward being PhD-esque in focusing a lot on kind of research and academics, or they were just kind of buried within degrees that were not quite organizational behavior. Like there are a lot of MBA, Masters in Business Administration programs that have some coursework there, but I really wanted to go deep. At the time, I was really adamant about staying in the state of California, and I was only looking at programs in the state. I was really adamant about it. Somehow, and I don't even remember how, I stumbled across a program that was right outside of Chicago in Evanston, Illinois at Northwestern University. And when I read the description of the program, I was like, this is exactly what I want to do. Okay. It's called the Masters of Science in Learning and Organizational Change, or MSLOC program. And they were focused on learning and performance, knowledge management, strategic change, all of these kind of things that come together to help understand how you can help people and organizations work more effectively, right? To make change and transformation happen. Now, here's where things get interesting. So, at the time I was like, okay, well, since, and anyone who's applied for school before, typically speaking, you have to apply in the fall in order to get in for the following fall. But as it turned out, this program had what's called rolling admissions. So even though I found out about it in the spring, I was able to apply to get in for that fall. I applied really close to the deadline because I found out about it really close to the deadline, but I applied, got in. I had to get a letter of recommendation. Now let's go back to the beginning when I talked about my mentor who in the first place encouraged me to consider graduate school. She actually went to undergrad and graduate school at that university, Northwestern. I asked her to write my letter of recommendation and she did, which was beautiful. A few weeks later, I found out that I got into the university. Now, here's another thing to keep in mind. This program only accepted people who had at least 3 years of work experience, a full-time work experience. I just kind of had barely what they required. It turns out that I was actually the youngest person, or one of the youngest people that applied in that program or for that program. So, they wanted to interview me, and mind you, they're right outside of Chicago. I'm in California. And they said, well, since you're so far away, we'd love to interview you in person, but we can just do a phone interview. And I said, you know what? As it happens, I'm going to be in a conference in Chicago next week. Mind you, this conference had been planned in January of that year before I even heard about this program. And guess who asked me to go to this conference? Again, that same mentor who had asked me or advised me that I needed to start thinking about graduate school, who also went to Northwestern, who also wrote my letter of recommendation, who was also going to be at the conference with me, who ended up taking me to my interview at Northwestern University, where she herself had graduated from. Okay? So, synchronicity everywhere, things just kind of aligning perfectly. Did my interview. Not only did I do my interview, but I got to audit some classes, which means I got to sit in and observe and even participate. And I was in love. It was just perfectly aligned for me. And as it turns, I was also aligned for the program. So they accepted me. I got into the program. Then came figuring out, okay, how am I going to finance this degree? And I applied for financial aid, found out that, as with a lot of graduate programs, I was going to have to take on some student loans. And unfortunately, they told me I needed a co-signer, and there wasn't anybody in my family that was able to do that. But I was determined, and I was able to figure that out. Again, my mentor came in, agreed to co-sign for me, and we had an agreement that I would refinance when I got out of school, which I did. And so despite all of the odds, despite the timing not seeming like it could work, despite everything kind of working against me, things just lined up every single step of the way. And things that occurred beforehand, right? Months and months beforehand, even in some ways years beforehand that did not seem related, came into play later. And so that was a period of my life where I felt like it was clear that God was trying to push me into a certain direction. He was allowing me to lose things that I really, really wanted, that were comfortable for me, that were no longer serving me, and kind of forced me to see what kind of decisions would serve me best. Now, it was up to me to make those decisions. And this is where I think free will comes in. I could have chosen to stay within my comfort zone, but in the end, I chose to take a risk and to kind of listen to that intuition. And I think that's kind of, when I say it's a little bit of both, I think part of it is that if you align your intention with the divine, then your steps are so moved, right? So if you have free will, which I believe all human beings do have, but you surrender that free will to some regard to the divine, and you're making sure that you're always tapped into the divine, then I think your free will is guided. And I think your steps are guided. And then I think that's when you see things happening for a reason in a way that is reflective of something bigger than you, right? It's like you're allowing the universe, God, the creator, to kind of move on your behalf, and you're allowing those things to happen, right? There's also the question of things that seem really unfortunate that happen to us, right? And one of my kind of pet peeves is when people imply that the worst things that happen to people are because, they're meant to happen in a way that's kind of dismissive of their struggle. I think it's really way more deep than that, right? Because unfortunately, the way that free will works is that people, because we have free will, our free will can affect people around us. I once spoke at a vigil for Nia Wilson, a young woman from my hometown of Oakland, California, whose life was tragically taken away by a white supremacist. Now, I don't believe that it was God's plan for Nia for her life to be taken away in that way. I don't believe that. I believe that someone's terrible decision, robbed her of what I think God had planned for her. But the people in her life have chosen to make meaning out of that. And that's powerful, right? So, while they would not have certainly chosen that for that to happen to her, and while she would not have chosen that to happen to her, we've chosen as a community to make meaning out of that, and to, we'll never make it make sense. We'll never make it okay. It's never going to be okay. But we can try to take something that was meant for evil and find some good in it. And I want to be very careful with that analogy because, I know a lot of people affected by that, and I don't want to use Nia's memory in some way to prove a point. But I do want to kind of say and honor her that she belongs here with us. But because of someone's terrible decision, she's not here. And we're choosing to make meaning out of that. We're choosing to keep her legacy alive. We're choosing to, make it in some way something that people can benefit from. if that makes sense, right? And so I think, again, that goes back to the both end. I think that some things happen, everything does happen for a reason, but some of those reasons are the choices that we make. And I think that there is some degree of divine intervention. I also think there's some degree of, meanings that we make after tragedies because we're choosing to try to make something good out of something awful. It doesn't take away the fact that it is awful. It doesn't make it okay, but it does make it meaningful. It does turn the struggle into something that can be useful. And I know this was a bit of a stream of consciousness, but if you're at a place right now where you're kind of struggling, you're not sure if the things in your life are happening for a reason, if you're trying to make meaning out of it, know that, in my opinion, there's never anything wrong with trying to find meaning in something, right? Like there's never anything wrong with taking something that was difficult and finding the gems in there. Because, there's another quote by Mandy Hale, an author, and she says that anything that happens to you can happen for you if you let it. And I think that's really powerful. So while the divine does not control us like puppets and our choices mean more than sometimes we recognize they do, there is always the power of choosing to make meaning, to find lessons out of the things and the circumstances in our life that we can't control, because we can't control most of these things. What we can control is our focus. What we can control are our responses, our actions, right? So I think that's where the power is. That is where we can really make these things work towards our greater good in the end. So yeah, that was long. That was a little random. I think at some points I may have trailed off. Hopefully you were able to follow along. Otherwise, I thank you for sharing this time with me. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think? Do you think that everything happens for a reason? Do you think that everything is just random? Do you think it's somewhere in between like me? I'd love for you to share your thoughts. I like to think that you all are some of my muses. You inspire me just sharing these thoughts with you. So share your thoughts with me as well. Otherwise, I hope you have a good one.